Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to the 13th Annual Undergraduate, Midwestern Undergraduate Philosophy Conference, and welcome to Creighton, those of you who are visiting. To get things going today, we have our roundtable discussion on what is metaphysics. Our panelists are, and I'd like to thank them for coming and welcome them, Dr. David Barnett, who's our keynote speaker. He'll be speaking tomorrow night on Truth and Counterfactuals from University of Colorado Boulder, kindly visiting us here. Dr. Patrick Murray from Creighton's Philosophy Department, Dr. Jack Carlson from Creighton, and our student panelists and the president of Phi Sigma Tau, Anthony Schlimgen. Chris Pliatska from Creighton's Philosophy Department also will be moderating our discussion, so I'm going to let him take it away.
Okay. Well, the topic here today is what is metaphysics, and we've asked the panelists to discuss or talk about several questions, and basically they'll have some opening remarks about 7 to 8 minutes, and to get the discussion rolling. And Anne's actually passing out the questions they've been asked to consider. But I just thought we could begin by framing the discussion a bit. So one of the questions we asked under the heading of what is metaphysics is what is or should metaphysics be concerned with, as you can see on the sheet. In other words, what is its subject matter? Now, interestingly enough, historically, metaphysicians have really conceived their enterprise in quite different ways. One traditional answer, I'm sure some of our panelists will give something in this ballpark, that may be called Aristotelian in nature, is conceived metaphysics as basically investigating the nature, constitution, and structure of ultimate reality. So that's one way of approaching the question, and not especially illuminating. But we can contrast it with a sharply, with another conception, a sharply divergent conception. And according to that contrasting conception, metaphysics is concerned not with investigating the nature of ultimate reality, but it's concerned with describing the most general features of our thought about the world. So it's concerned with identifying, for example, the most general concepts we use to represent the world. Clearly, investigating our concepts is very different from investigating the nature of reality. So that is one broad, just to frame the question as far as approaching that issue. Another question is, as we see on the sheets there, is whether truth can be achieved in metaphysics. In other words, is there such a thing as metaphysical knowledge? That question is really interesting because I'll be interested to see what the panelists have to say, because there's no really uncontroversial answers in metaphysics. Or in philosophy, actually, turns out. So, I mean, but it's especially acute, I think, in metaphysics. So, can we achieve knowledge in that? And, tied to that question is another one, is the question of whether, what's the best methodology to take to approaching these questions? What's the proper methodology, right? Many metaphysicians view their enterprise as fundamentally non-empirical in nature. In other words, it's a priori, right? And so that seems to contrast sharply with science. And so another question we'd be curious to hear is about the relationship between science and metaphysics. So be very interested to hear what they have to say. And Dr. Barnett is going to go first. And they can address any of these questions, whatever they're interested in addressing. And so let's keep going.
Oh, your last comment sort of threw me. I wasn't prepared at all, but briefly, I was planning just then to start with the first question. Is the idea that we just jump around?
Sure. Anything you're interested in.
Well, I'll start just real briefly with the first question, and then later maybe talk a little bit about the relationship science has to metaphysical questions. But, right, I don't have a real nuanced view of what metaphysics is. It would be pretty much stated in the one sentence that you began with. Metaphysics is the study of the nature of reality. So it would be harder for me to find something that's not metaphysics. So it's hard when I explain to my introductory to philosophy students that there's maybe 3 areas of philosophy: metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, if I divide it up that way. And I say metaphysics is the theory of reality, theory of everything. And what you want is a list of everything that exists. You want an account of the nature of everything that exists. You want an account of the relationship among all the things that exist. the structure. You want to know what's fundamental, what's less fundamental. You want to know how all the sciences fit together. You just want a theory of everything. It's a huge book that describes all of reality. And then I say, and then there's this other topic. That's a little weird, right? You just described all of reality, that you've left something out. But there's this other topic, epistemology, the theory of knowledge, which you could think is just a subfield of metaphysics. It's the nature of knowledge, which exists in reality, or ethics, theory of how we ought to act. That might be a little more puzzling, by the way, why ethics isn't in this big book. So if we spend the next day together, or a day and a half together, writing this huge book of metaphysics that gives the nature of everything that exists, the relationship between all the things that exist, the fundamental particles in the world, conscious beings, economies, anything posited by the sciences, and we close this huge book, and then somebody says, should we go grab a Big Mac? And we think, oh, well, we'll just answer the question, because we just finished our book of everything. So we go flipping through the book that describes the nature of reality, and then you think, well, the answer's just not in here. This book describes reality in its nature, but it doesn't tell us what we ought to do. So there, at least initially, you can see how there's a question that's hard to fit within metaphysics. But aside from that, I would just say that metaphysics pretty much covers everything. Yeah.
Well, actually, we'll open it up after. Once we just want to get everyone to have their sort of saying. Basically, we'll start with Dr. Barnett, then we'll go to Anthony, then Dr. Murray, and then Dr. Carlson.
Yeah, I actually have similar interests in metaphysics and more specifically epistemology and the philosophy of science. So I actually came to metaphysics through epistemology. But so it kind of gives me an interesting view of metaphysics. But I also think of, when I first think of metaphysics, I think of Aristotle's phrase that it's first philosophy. You have to wonder what that means, and Chris talked about that a little bit. I take it, there's the one meaning where it's like the most important self-discipline in philosophy, right? That may be why it's first. Or, like Chris and Dr. Barnett says, study the most general categories of reality. Which I like, because I think it's interesting, because I think there are general categories of reality which we can talk about. But what's really interesting is that Aristotle opens the metaphysics with a line that we all know. Every human being by nature desires to know, which seems to me to be a claim about epistemology, and not a claim about knowledge. So it makes me wonder what the relationship between epistemology and metaphysics is. And to bear with me on this, I'm going to read a quote from Wilfrid Sellers, and he's talking about Kant on this, but he's making a point I think that's kind of important. This is during one of Sellers' lecture, and he has a lectern in front of him. He says, Kant does not think that we have a right to say that there is a lectern in itself, as a thing in itself in its own right. He certainly thinks that there is something, some aspect of the in itself, which is a counterpart of the lectern. Of course he did. Since he is a metaphysician, his main point is, as you might suspect, a metaphysical one pertaining to epistemology. It's part of his metaphysics of epistemology that we can say, aha, that which corresponds to the lectern, that we can't say, aha, that which corresponds to the lectern is a plurality of monads, or that which corresponds to the lectern is a feature of God. But still, there is a counterpart of the lectern. Naturally, he takes it for granted because of his political situation. That's in the context of Leibniz and conversation about monads. But the interesting thing I think that Sellers, the claim that Sellers might be making is something like this, is that in the study of either metaphysics or epistemology, one will be subject to either epistemological or metaphysical commitments about which you are making metaphysical or epistemological claims. So if you're doing metaphysics, you're committed to certain epistemological assumptions, and your metaphysics is really making claims about those epistemological assumptions, and the same for epistemology. And in that way, I think the two subdisciplines are not really separable in the way that some people may think they are, maybe not. But what's interesting, too, to me is the relationship, one of the conversation topics was between speculative metaphysics and natural science, or maybe the philosophy of natural science. And I think there might be two sides of the same coin, or at least maybe similar sides. And that in speculative metaphysics, epistemology is usually set as some sort of, not necessarily a constant, but you have a methodology that's set out before that you go through your investigation of metaphysics using, and you don't really question your epistemological assumptions so often. And instead, your questions are about ontology, the types of objects, the types of categories, the types of stuff that's out there, right? Whereas in natural sciences, the ontology is in its own place. It's fluid. We'll talk about that in a second. But the interesting questions are epistemological. They're not metaphysical in natural sciences. You ask questions like, how do we track the behavior of such and such an object? How do we characterize the behavior of such and such an object? And what are the methods of investigation such that we can make true claims about such and such an object? But you'll also see in natural sciences that the ontology is not static; it's fluid. And so and this is the relationship, I think, with speculative metaphysics as well, is that depending on the progress you make in understanding your speculative metaphysics or your ontology in science, your ontology will change, your metaphysics will change. So we have the examples that we have in the natural sciences are, of course, gravity, the theory of relativity, and then like wave-particle duality of light. And you see not only theoretical shifts in the consideration of objects, but ontological shifts in the consideration of objects. That in reality, people start saying light has a dual nature, that space-time is like a fabric, and you make ontological claims based on epistemological conclusions. And so I think, in discussing the relation between metaphysics and epistemology, I think kind of two of the important disciplines in philosophy, it's difficult to extricate one from the other because the questions involved in either presuppose commitments about the other. And because of that, it makes the two a conversation about really the same thing, which I'd like to echo Dr. Barnett's sentiments that both epistemology and metaphysics are conversations about the nature of reality and reality taken as a whole. And that considering metaphysics as only that conversation, I think misses the point about epistemology, that in order to talk about the world at all, to make claims about the world, you're also undertaking an epistemological project. So that's where my interests lie in metaphysics and epistemology.
I'd like to see metaphysics deal with the question of bubbles. The bubbles I have in mind are the ones that we're living in the wake of, in particular the housing bubble. So what's a bubble in that sense, right? So if you look at, sorry I didn't have my handy graph of what housing prices look like over 100 years of time, but when you hit about 2001, they start going like this for about 5-6 years, and then they go a different direction. So what's a bubble? Bubble, I think, is a gap between price and value. So bubbles raise for me the question of value. And value, I think, is a concept. Value is something that metaphysics, I think, would be very interesting subject matter. What is value? How much value has been lost in the current crisis? $5 trillion worth of value, something like that? I don't know. So what's gone? What is this stuff that's gone, that's changed life all over the planet? Seems like that should be a pretty significant metaphysical question. What is this? What is this stuff? And I think that question can't really be separated from other interesting questions like what is money and what is capital. So let me come back to those by turning to Heidegger and his approach to metaphysics in being and time. Early in the book, he's got some really interesting passages about, sound like Thomas Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, about fundamental concepts and how the big changes in science, what Kuhn maybe call revolutions in science, really have to do with shifts in fundamental concepts, and they shift the ontology. So it kind of picks up on what I think you were saying, Anthony. So he has an idea that you've got sort of different level. You've got kind of a pre-scientific understanding, interpretation of being and the whole realm of beings, and you kind of divide things up into like living beings and non-living beings. And so we get biology is going to deal with the living beings, or you get the human sciences based on, well, there's humans and then there's non-humans. So that in these just really ways of kind of sizing up the whole terrain of being. And those fundamental concepts are, it seems to me, kind of where metaphysics and sciences are meeting, and I think it's very hard to tell what he talks about, how scientific changes in science and what we think about the world, they might be the kind of thing that would spark kind of a redoing of the domain. I think some of the things that Anthony mentioned. So we get a pretty radically different approach in physics with quantum physics or with general relativity and so forth, and kind of shakes things up in a big way. So he's got that idea and he's kind of looking around Heidegger and saying, yeah, this is where the really big change happens, and when these fundamental concepts change. And how they change, I think, is a little bit tricky. Now he thinks, of course, the bone that he wants to pick is he wants to look at being just as being. Because in the whole domain of being, the question of what being is relevant wherever you turn. And that's really his special focus. And to get at that, though, and this relates maybe to also what Anthony, you were saying about epistemology and metaphysics being inextricable, he first begins with the question of who's asking the question of being. And we need to learn about the being of that being. And that of course takes you into what could, knowing, of course, the being that asks that question, like us, kind of being, we're knowers, as you say, the first sentence from Aristotle's Metaphysics. So I want to just come back to the question about value by way of, I think in the mid-19th century there was a great scientific revolution that was kind of lost and overlooked, inaugurated by Karl Marx with historical materialism. And I think there's a very simple, and I think it's a way, it works at the level of those fundamental concepts. I think what Marx really saw was the idea that we are a species, we have needs, we have to meet our needs by producing things. That's always a social project. And there is no society in general. There's only specific kinds of societies that are full of specific kinds of relations, that are full of implications, moral, political, social implications. And this, I think, is his something that he would really add, that historical materialism really adds to the kind of phenomenology of Dasein, or human beings, that Heidegger offers. So I think there's a kind of revolution that takes place there with historical materialism. Marx's approach to modern society, capitalist society, really focuses then, really raises that question of value, and really pursues the relationship between value, money, and capital as value that, as he puts it, valorizes itself. Basically, a value that makes more value, money that makes more money, roughly speaking. So I think that revolution that Marx undertakes, which really, to my mind, calls into question the foundations of a social science like economics, which pretends to be a generally applicable theory of, I'm not sure just what, like, I don't know what, making decisions under conditions of scarcity. So like, if you're a point guard, you want to get out your micro book, I'm not sure. But only so many people to throw the ball to. I think Marx, that revolution, really calls that into question. And on the one hand, on the other hand, I think it opens up some opportunities for tackling what I think is this really vital metaphysical question about what is value.
Well, my view will be different. I'm delighted to be here with you, and I must say, when I got this list of questions, which were composed by students, some of whom had taken a metaphysics course from me. I thought, what a great list of questions. These students are really good. And then I thought, oh, no, wait a minute. If they're asking these questions, then they haven't been convinced by anything that I tried to teach them last year. So I'm not so sure. I'm not sure how to take it, except that these are an outstanding list of questions. I do believe. I have a handout that I'm going to have sent around. I hope there are enough copies. I will try to be very brief at the beginning, and then we'll see where the discussion wants to go. Our moderator, Bozeman. Do you want to have it in here? Is there any extras? Yeah.
Over here.
There should be.
It's not a condition of scarcity.
Yeah, the whole
Well, our moderator, Chris Pliatska, mentioned Aristotle's understanding of metaphysics, nature of ultimate reality, and he characterized that it was not particularly illuminating. Did I get that right?
Yes. Well, it doesn't tell us what ultimate reality is, what the relationships are, and all that.
Well, I'm here to speak for a not particularly illuminating point of view. And it's a point of view that certainly has origins in Aristotle, and indeed before Aristotle. It has had reiterations throughout the history of at least Western philosophy. And some of us are pursuing it in the present day. One intellectual hero of mine, Jacques Maritain, the French philosopher who immigrated to the United States. And he is one of those who coined this term perennial philosophy. And the idea of a perennial philosophy is the idea of a philosophy that, like perennial flowers, has a common stock of ideas, but then not every year, as with flowers, but every generation or every era, the ideas come up again and are recognizably part of the same stock, but they grow and they develop in light of other aspects of the intellectual culture. So that's my favorite metaphor for describing a philosophical tradition. This tradition was mentioned by Pope John Paul II in his encyclical Fides Ratio of 1998, and there I have a little quote from that piece also, and he explicitly mentions an enduringly valid philosophical tradition. I take it that by that he means the perennial tradition. And in some of his early philosophical writings, he identified himself as a part of that perennial tradition. And he does speak forthrightly of metaphysical truth, which of course is a matter of great controversy in our own day. But it's a matter that is very deeply embedded in the Aristotelian tradition. How do we get to philosophical truth? Well, the rest of the handout that I give you is from a philosophical dictionary that's going to be published by Notre Dame Press in the fall. And for better or worse, it does contain the germ of answers to these questions. You don't answer a set of philosophical questions by giving somebody a dictionary or any other kind of book, but well, as a matter of fact, the dictionary entries presuppose these answers to these philosophical questions. This dictionary would be sort of the anti-Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, where Simon Blackburn writes, when he talks about being, this is his entry for being, everything real and nothing unreal belongs to the domain of being. But there is very little that can be said about everything that is real, especially from within the philosopher's study. So it is not apparent that there can be such a subject as being by itself. And then he goes on to say, a central mistake in this area is to treat being as a noun that identifies a particularly deep subject matter. I love that. That is, in some ways, it's the inspiration for my own dictionary, which comes from a very different tradition and different kinds of roots. Philosophical dictionaries themselves are interesting matters for investigation. Actually, there are at least 12 or 15 philosophical dictionaries in print at this time, and they differ tremendously in scope, in assumptions, quite a fascinating study in itself. Now, back to our topic. We want to know being, and we want to know something about being itself, its intelligible features. Pace, Simon Blackburn, there are intelligible features of being. There are categories and types of being that can be identified. Anthony referred to those. And there are questions of causality that are very important in understanding of being. And those are the questions that metaphysics pursues. On the handout, you may notice that I have a very short way of answering number 5. How does one think about ontology in relation to metaphysics? As others have said, including Dr. Barnett, different philosophers have conceived metaphysics in different ways. To me, it seems best to think of ontology as simply a part of metaphysics, and it's that part that tries to give an account of the various types or categories of being. That's one part of the metaphysical task. And it seems to me that that's a serviceable answer to the question about how they're related. But it frankly is not very illuminating, because you have to then go on to see what the rest of it means. Anthony mentioned the relation between epistemology and metaphysics, and I think those points were very well taken. And the work of Wilfrid Sellers is very well taken in that regard. The tradition that I represent is called a form of critical realism. Critical realism. That is to say that the human mind, through the senses and the intellect, is able to some extent to make real contact with what is, with objective reality, and to some extent is able to articulate the nature of that reality. Incompletely, to be sure, partially, inadequate, but nonetheless in a way that, as John Paul II says, can make a claim to truth. And this is because of the kind of ability we have to develop concepts. The relation that Chris Pliatska mentioned about being and the concept of being is another interesting one to explore. And a lot depends on how you understand the human ability to form concepts, what they are and how it is possible, and what relation concepts have to reality. For the Aristotelian tradition, it is the case that our knowledge by way of concepts and judgments to some extent can represent reality as it is. And this, by contrast with, especially Immanuel Kant, but his precursors and successors who have been enormously influential into the present day, the Aristotelian tradition thinks that was a wrong turn, and that we can satisfy ourselves that we do know things about reality. In some of these entries, I discuss different kinds of facts. That is, there's an entry for the word fact, and that was one of the questions on the list. There's an entry for the word fact, and following a 20th century Aristotelian Yves Simon, I like to distinguish common facts from scientific facts, from philosophical facts. So, somewhat surprisingly at first hearing, there are such things as philosophical facts. That is to say, there would be facts which are of a very, very, very general nature, such that one need not have any specialized training to become aware of them, and reflection upon which give rise to philosophical concepts and philosophical judgments about reality. Facts such as the beings of our experience come into existence and go out of existence. While in existence, they exist as beings of their respective types, and they undergo manifold changes of many, many sorts during their careers in existence, while remaining the same types of things. Those are the examples of what I would call philosophical facts, and reflection on those facts gives rise to concepts such as substance as the core reality, the core kind of reality, and various other features. The scholastics call these accidents, things that happen to the substance. But whatever names we give them, qualities, features, accidents, there is a kind of important difference between substantial being and this other kind of being that depends for its being on substantial being. That's just a first way into the topic of metaphysics.
Well, I thought we could open it up to discussion. Very broad questions. Actually, I have one question. I thought you had said something pretty interesting about the, this big book, right? And you said it seems as though ethics doesn't fit neatly into that book. And I wonder, if we take, you talk about facts, right? If we take, facts as one type of entity that sort of exists as part of metaphysical enterprise, would you sort of count as normative facts, like it's a fact that one ought to do such and such, or, kind of value fact, it's a fact that such and such a thing is inherently good? Would that be part of the book, or not? Or do you think it would be, we can't countenance within our sort of metaphysical picture normative facts, but all facts are not normative?
Then that's interesting. I like that idea. So if you abstract away, I was imagining that our book of everything was going to be a book of everything concrete. So I wasn't including abstract entities, which it should include. So I was imagining that we go to all the sciences around this campus: biology department, chemistry department, physics department, economics department, to answer your questions about the bubble. So economics department posits bubbles, biology department posits enzymes, and I was imagining we just get a systematic theory of everything that's being studied on this campus. Of course, once we went over to the math department, then we start positing abstract things like numbers, and when we take a look at ourselves, the philosophers, we're going to have to posit a lot more abstract things like maybe fact. So I disagree on what a fact is from this definition, but I would say, yeah, a fact is a true idea. So here's a fact. That beings exist, that's something I believe. So it's this idea, you can accept it or reject it, that beings exist. It's true that beings exist, so it's a fact that beings exist. And that thing should end up in the book because it seems to exist, this idea. And we could, in the book also, you want to explain what it is. What is a fact? What is an idea? Maybe I'm wrong, maybe facts aren't really ideas. The dominant view is that they're not ideas. They're the things that make ideas true. But the book needs to have all of that laid out. And then, as I said it, I do give a description of metaphysics as just a study of the fully general features of reality, as many philosophers do. I said it's everything. So it should include a list of all the facts, right? Including the normative facts. The fact that you ought not go to McDonald's after this talk. Or if that's a fact, or that you ought to go to McDonald's and get your french fries, if that's a fact. So you're right, it should actually include those facts in it. And so when I said ethics appears to be separate, I don't know whether I actually said this, but I should have said initially. Like, at least initially, it looks like you can ask a question that's not yet answered in this book. It's an ought question. What should we do? And the book just says how things are, including the facts. It describes the facts. And you say, well, that's great, but what ought we to do? On second look, you should have the answers to ethical questions in second book, too.
If I could just add, it seems to me that there is an importance in distinguishing ethics from metaphysics, though. Even though I think that there are facts, if I could still be allowed to use that word, I think there are facts on which ethics or our moral judgments are based, facts about what is required for human fulfillment, how going to McDonald's or not going to McDonald's might contribute to our well-being and so on. I don't think in terms of moral facts, ethical facts as such, but ethical judgments would be of a different order, while at the same time depending in fact in various ways on the facts that would be in your big book of metaphysics.
And so would you think they would all? Are you suggesting that we should have a separate book for?
A separate book, but a companion volume, you might say.
And would you, just out of curiosity, would you think the answer to the question, what is the nature of moral rightness, should that be in the book of metaphysics? And what is moral rightness?
We all think of that as a question of meta-ethics, right? And
somewhere between ethics and meta-ethics.
It's meta-ethics. When I was going to school, it was called meta-ethics. In fact, when I was going to school, meta-ethics was about all there was in ethics. But that would be a classic example of a meta-ethical question, which is a second-order question. So it's not part of ethics directly, that is normative theory directly. It's not part of metaphysics, that is what is directly, but it's a step back and look at the landscape question. What do we mean by rightness, and how, if at all, can we justify claims about moral rightness and so on?
Question for Professor Carlson, but others might want to respond to this, but I suspect that, this is a short argument that you would disagree with. I'd like to know what's wrong with this. A.J. Ayer, famous critic of metaphysics, A.J. Ayer says metaphysics makes these synthetic a priori claims, and then he says we can't have any synthetic a priori knowledge, so metaphysics can yield no knowledge. What do
That is a pretty short argument.
I mean, but that's just a sketch of the general point, right? What do you think about that, or where does that go wrong?
Well, you know, I had lunch with A.J. Ayer one day. and we talked about such things. I was a graduate student. Came to my school and gave a talk. I didn't ask very good questions at the time. But obviously the question itself incorporates a certain amount of philosophical conceptualization, synthetic a priori, for example, synthetic a priori. And since Kant, we've come to think in those categories, as well as whatever other categories we may, epistemological categories we may have. But I would begin by questioning the foundational notions about synthetic a priori and then investigating why Ayer and many, many others have good reasons for doubting that there can be synthetic a priori propositions. The facts that I think philosophy can be built upon are not a priori. They are facts of experience as certainly as any litmus paper test in a chemistry lab is a fact of experience, but these are facts, very general facts of experience, so general as to be not of interest or direct relevance to any particular science. That's why they fall to philosophy to pick out. And then the philosophical judgments result from reflections on those facts. It doesn't seem to me that you need to accept the idea that there are synthetic a priori judgments.
It's interesting though, because I mean, as far as metaphysics go, you know, but a lot of metaphysicians think of it as a fundamentally a priori enterprise, right? But Dr. Barnett's way of casting it out seems that it includes science, right? So they're not, it's sort of, they're overlapping, but not distinct.
Right, which raises the question number, this is what we're discussing now, I suppose, number 4. What relationship, by the way, these are excellent questions. I was very impressed when I saw them too. Great questions. What relationship, if any, do claims of natural science have to those of metaphysics? I categorize metaphysics extremely broadly to include a theory of everything, right? Which would include the question, how many students are on this campus right now? That's a metaphysical as opposed to an epistemic question. So I just defined it as generally as possible. As a matter of fact, most metaphysicians, most philosophers just aren't interested in the question, how many students are on campus right now? They're not interested in any questions that have contingent answers. As metaphysicians, they tend to be interested in questions whose answers hold necessarily. So they want to know, what is it to be a student, not how many students happen to be on campus. As I characterize it, though, how many students happen to be on campus, that's fair game. It's just not interesting. As a matter of fact, contingent fact hasn't been very interesting to most philosophers. And so then, if we just shift to the questions whose answers hold necessarily, questions about the nature of things, what is it to be a student? What is it to be in love? What is it to know something? What is a fact? What is a truth? Questions like those, then I'm inclined to think you have to go question by question or area by area to ask whether science has anything to say about these questions, or rather whether whether they're answerable at all. If so, whether it's only through the help of science, or whether we can know it just by pure reflection, a priori. And I think this is one of the most exciting developments in philosophy in the last maybe 100 years, is the idea that a lot of philosophical questions, or at least questions about the nature of things, can only be answered by science. And so, I don't know, raise your hand if you're familiar with Kripke and Putnam. couple people? Okay, a few. Right, so you might think at first glance that if philosophers are interested in how the world must be, in the nature of things, they're not so interested in how the world happens to be, how many students happen to be here, how many tigers there happen to be, and how many humans there happen to be. Those are contingent questions. You might think, well, philosophers would waste their time looking out at the world because all you'll find is how the world happens to be. Right? If you take a look, you're going to find out how many students happen to be on campus, how many tigers there happen to be, contingent facts. You're not going to find anything about the nature of the world. To find things about the nature of the world, you might think you have to just reflect and think, what are all the different ways the world could be? And it's not going to help going and looking. You just look through your mind. You think the world could be this way, it could be that way. And that's how you'll answer these questions, like, what is it to be a student? And what you ask in your mind, you say, well, as a matter of fact, no students who are over 13 feet tall. Is that part of the nature of a student? What do you guys think? Do you want to build it into the nature of a student that students must be under 13 feet tall? No. Why not? Because you're able to look through your mind and imagine, right, it seems possible to have a 13-foot tall student. So you just reflect and you think, well, our world isn't that way, but it could have been this way. And so philosophers have presumed until recently, at least most philosophers, that to answer these sorts of questions whose answers hold necessarily about the nature of things, you just reflect in your mind about all the different ways the world could be. You're wasting your time by looking at the world. And then recently, Kripke and Putnam argued pretty convincingly that that's just not true. A lot of these questions, you do need to go consult science and look at our world to find out how the world must be. So for instance, if I ask you, what's the nature of water? This is a famous example by Putnam. Can you just reflect in your own mind and come up with the answer to that, or do you need to go do science? What do you think? You can find out, how much water happens to be on Earth. You go look, but what is water essentially? You guys think you have to go look at water, or can you just know by nature, by reflection, that it's a sort of clear liquid that you can drink and it fills the streams and so on? Kripke and Putnam argued, no, you have to go look. And they argued by this thought experiment, both of them. They said, well, just imagine you find yourself on some other planet. It has the stuff that looks like water. It tastes like water. It has all the features that you would think water has just by casual reflection as a competent speaker of English. But in fact, the scientists tell you it's not made of H2O. And here on Earth, all the clear liquid stuff is made of H2O. Would that stuff merely look like water, or would it be water on this other planet if it's not made of H2O? What's the answer? Is it a water imposter, or is that stuff water too? It's an imposter, right? It looks like water, but it's not really. And what about a tiger? You go to another planet, you find something that looks like a tiger, it behaves like a tiger, but then you cut it open after it dies of natural causes. You cut it open, and it turns out it doesn't have the DNA. It doesn't even have DNA. It's silicon-based or something. Would that thing be a tiger? Or would it just have looked like a tiger? Right, so what we're finding is that to discover the essence of a tiger, to discover the essence of water, you actually have to do the science and find out what water is made of, what tigers are made of. And now the question arises, what's the scope of this? Does it turn out to find the essence of a conscious being? Do we have to cut open conscious beings in a nice way? Or can you just know by reflection? So currently, I think that's where the really exciting debate is today, is where the edge of this, it's called scientific essentialism, that the essences of things can only be known by science. Where the scope of that lies, does it include questions like, what is a conscious being? What is truth? What is knowledge? Do we have to ask the scientists about those, or can we know them by pure reflection?
Notice too, though, the assumption, which I don't necessarily take issue with, but with Kripke's example of going and finding the imposter water on wherever he happens to be. He's got the imposter water, but it's the decision about if it's real water or imposter water comes down to whether or not it's H2O, and which may be a fine criterion of adjudication, but what the claim, the assumption there is that this sort of methodology, this sort of explanation has the definitive explanation. This is the adjudicator, happens to be science in this case, and that in understanding scientific essentialism, okay, the assumption in scientific essentialism is that science happens to have the ability to adjudicate. And the question then becomes, to what extent can it adjudicate these questions? But it's interesting, I think, to me that that's a metaphysical position which rests on some pretty hefty epistemological assumptions about the justifications of claims about water and its imposter.
So do you think the justification for the conclusion that water is essentially H2O? What do you think the justification for that is?
I think the justification that Kripke seems to want to suggest presupposes some sort of theory about scientific essentialism. I don't know much about the debate, but as you have outlined, so I think which is epistemological presuppositions and assumptions, which are open to a conversation.
Right. I think his attempt was to have scientific essentialism as a conclusion, to be arguing for it. It brings up the same interesting question that you're raising, which is, what's his evidence for the view? And I think he would agree his evidence is the evidence I just elicited. It's just this intuition we have, which is something like a priori. He's giving us a priori argument for a view that certain philosophical questions are a posteriori, they're scientific. But his argument for it is a priori. It's just, it seems like that wouldn't be water. It seems like that wouldn't be a tiger. Something like that.
Are we really saying that everything that isn't an observation statement in science is now some sort of a priori? I'm concerned about a creeping a priorism here. And it just seems to me that there's plenty that we know, and plenty that Kripke and others have pointed to that are truths, matters of fact, but not in themselves scientific facts. And in Kripke's case, those facts would be facts about, not about water itself, but facts about our investigation into the nature of water and other such physical natures. Those would be the properly philosophical questions, and I think Kripke does a salutary service to philosophy in raising them in a way that challenged that tradition of Kant and empiricists when there weren't many others, weren't any other prominent philosophers doing that at the time.
Let's get the students involved here. There's a question over there.
I mean, I kind of hate to be the guy that brings in Wittgenstein to the conversation, but I can't really avoid it. So, but I mean, that, like what you're talking about, since he's on my mind, I think we just read him for one of my classes. Like, does the whole concept that, like what you were talking about, that you have to have, like the very idea about the debate about scientific essentialism and the metaphysics behind that, like doesn't that just presuppose some other ideas? Like, does it matter when we're talking about metaphysics if we're playing the game that Wittgenstein talked about, where whether or not we have foundationalism or whether or not we're in some kind of a web of concepts where we're, no matter what we do, we're stuck with certain assumptions, whether they're a priori or just something that we do to continue going on? Like, where does that fall on metaphysics, and what impact does the insight that Wittgenstein brings in come to play?
Well, Wittgenstein was certainly anti-metaphysics as he understood it, and he was anti-foundationalism. And many metaphysicians, apparently the ones that David hangs out with, are of that sort. But you don't have to be of that sort to be a metaphysician.
So, in fact, well, historically, some of the greatest metaphysicians they claim to hate metaphysics, right?
And I would have to say that some metaphysicians that I otherwise admired, colleagues that I otherwise admired, are very down on Wittgenstein. I guess by way of returning the favor, as they say. But I am not myself. Wittgenstein's idea of everyday language being full of uses of terms that have family resemblances, to me that is very much like what Aristotle wrote about the prosame equivocal, what Aquinas wrote about as the analogous language, terms that do not have the same meaning in every instance of their use, but have different, although related meanings. And an interesting task for philosophy is to trace out those relationships. Now that doesn't get to, Wittgenstein's approach doesn't get you to all the metaphysics that the Aristotelian tradition wants to get to. And if Wittgenstein is completely right, then you can't do all this metaphysics that the Aristotelian tradition wants to. But there are affinities there that I think should be recognized and exploited.
I wanted to trying to think of how you pose that question, like that we're sort of caught up in a web of concepts, and I guess I'm wondering what kind of picture is involved in that. And going back to something Chris said at the very beginning, the second idea of metaphysics. In other words, are we assuming that this, by being caught up in these concepts, that now we're at some remove from the world? I mean, why should that be a problem? I guess, one of the things I thought, what's the proper or best methodology in metaphysics? One answer would be thinking. Thinking, and this I think gets back to Heidegger's approach to it, is that, well, who's doing metaphysics? We are. And how are we doing it? We're thinking. And so we ought to think about that. I mean, that's how he approaches it. And I think what he wants to do is to say, this idea, the worry that we're not really thinking about the world, we're just thinking about our thoughts, which are at a remove from the world, which I think is maybe from Strawson.
Yeah, well,
or one version of it anyway, that we shouldn't be worried about that. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't be worried about making mistakes and getting things wrong, but we shouldn't be worried about that just sort of like in principle, like from the get-go, it's like, hey, we're in the world of concepts, so sorry, we're out of luck. You know, so I don't know. I'm always puzzled at just how to take Wittgenstein. Whether, I mean, Cora Diamond, who was here some years ago, she has an article where basically she tries to argue that to read Wittgenstein that no, it's just, I mean, it doesn't mean we're not in touch with the truth. And I'd like to think she was right, but it's a difficult essay. I'm not so sure.
I guess on my thoughts on Wittgenstein, I said, kind of thinking that Dr. Barnett was saying about Creighton earlier, is, I mean, one of the ways I think of Wittgenstein, whether or not it's accurate, is, you talked about these propositions being binding in a way we can't get out of them. We're kind of forced to abide by their truth conditions, maybe. But, and you kind of contrast that maybe with foundationalism or compared to foundationalism. One way I'd like to think about Wittgenstein out is that these propositions, while they're binding, not one of them is a noose. And you won't hang yourself on any of the propositions in the system because it doesn't mean you can't. Wittgenstein, you just can't do it. You change the system. That's what happens. You don't stop living. You change. But why? And then maybe why metaphysics, right? Because Dr. Barnett was talking about that metaphysicians look for a priori truths that are necessarily true, that truths that aren't subject to that sea change in the system. And so I think that's one of the ways I like to think about Wittgenstein as being opposed to metaphysics. But like I talked about at the beginning about with science, how, as an example, I think science is a type of metaphysics. It's not speculative metaphysics. You do a lot of thinking in science, but it's not speculative metaphysical thinking. Sometimes you do. But I think science is an example of a way that an ontology, a metaphysical picture, can change while still maintaining a coherent and continuous picture of reality from before the change to after. If you can split up the change, assuming you really can. But science is an example of how a metaphysical worldview, which science is a metaphysical worldview, we talk about particles, we talk about objects, how it can change. And that when it changes, metaphysicians don't have to go out and jump off the bridge because water turns into D2O or whatever. They don't have to do that because you can change the metaphysical system, and it doesn't. You keep on going afterwards. It's not that big of a deal. It's a big deal, but not that big of a deal.
I don't think it's even that big. The metaphysician operates not in an a priori way, but at least my kind, not in an a priori way, but at a different level of abstraction. And so the statements about which the metaphysician might be making judgments, say scientific statements, they become the subject matters. And so you just talked about scientific changes. Well, a philosophical question is, what is the nature of change? And how do we understand the realities of our experience as having a kind of fundamental character, but ever-changing qualities? And the concepts of potentiality and actuality come into philosophy by reflection on these facts that the sciences study in a much more particular way. It seems to me that the disciplines are complementary. They don't, or they should challenge one another. There can be border disputes at the margins. There will always be border disputes. Are leptons and quarks substances? And who gets to answer that question? My inclination is to say no. They don't have enough of the kind of reality that makes for substance to call them substances, but that certainly is a good question. And it's a question that both the scientist and the philosopher has an interest in answering, but they come at it from different perspectives, different levels of abstraction, I call it.
Any questions? Students?
Well, originally I wanted that idea of metaphysical facts. Before I walked into this room, that didn't sound like a possibility to me. And so, Dr. Barnett and Dr. Carlson, more so for you, how do you confront the undying skeptic on a metaphysical fact? And then maybe how do you sell your book of metaphysics to an undying skeptic? Because it seems like you kind of touched on it with kind of the relationship between science and metaphysics. But I'm wondering, is there any way that, does metaphysics have to be this, does it have to be the same for everyone? I hate to use objective, but does it have to be objective? Or is there a way of making it somewhat personal or different through various kind of viewpoints?
Well, as everybody has been saying all along, obviously metaphysics has meant different things to different people, and so in that sense, there isn't just one thing called metaphysics. And apart from the great originators, most philosophers work out of some tradition or other, with some set of assumptions or other. And there are different ways of understanding metaphysics in those different traditions. Now, if somebody is a diehard skeptic, I forget, how did you characterize it?
Undying.
Undying. Well, that's diehard. He refuses to die. Undying skeptic. There's only so much by way of argumentation that you can do. And this was pointed out by Aristotle long ago. You can't prove those things that are most basic. That's why they are most basic. They're not subject to proof by something that is more basic. But you can try to convince the other that the consequences of accepting his or her point of view are really unwelcome and not really tolerable. And that's a kind of dialectical reasoning back and forth. And so if somebody says there are no facts, or there are no facts that could give rise to philosophical concepts, I would simply say, well, let's look at these. Facts about natural being and about change and about development and so on. These facts give rise to plenty of philosophical concepts, and now we're off and running. And if you don't want to run with us, that's okay. But the skepticism is your problem, not mine. Just because you hurt your foot, I don't have to limp.
I mean, I like Aristotle, but that does seem a little bit like we have nothing to learn. And that I know perennial, the Maritain quote said that it's progressive, but how progressive is it? I mean, is metaphysics itself not just addressing new realities from perennial standpoints, but is metaphysics itself actually developing that the very way in which we think about the whole and the parts and the divisions has a historical character? I mean, I think one of the great contributions of more recent philosophy, I'm talking about hundreds of years, to more classical philosophy is that strong sense of history and temporality and trying to bring being and temporality together at all sorts of levels with a lot of failure and struggle and skepticism as a result. But I think the general kind of responsibility to see that through the course of Western history, this problem of time has stepped forward is really fundamental to what we mean by reason, being, the good. To me, that's a task that I don't know these categories really are addressing. It's almost like, okay, at the very most basic level, time doesn't really reach. And then we have science, that changes. And history changes and politics changes, but at the very level of being and the partitions of being and the categories of being, that is unchanging. It's like a way of conceiving the unchanging and history. And I just wonder if there's a better way to get at being than splitting off the unchanging and the changing in that way.
I would say sure. Aristotle doesn't really split it off that way either. And that would be a kind of caricature of the Aristotelian approach. Some Aristotelians have deserved that caricature, no doubt about it. But Anthony's point about relative stability in concepts, I think, is a good one. The scientific concepts and theories change much more frequently and much more radically than the metaphysical ones, I think. But metaphysical ones certainly undergo a process of development themselves.
But just what would an example of that be at the level of being, of a change at the level of being?
The incorporation of the notion of agency, actuality, as a fundamental dimension of all being. That's something that is not explicitly there in Aristotle, but some recent philosophers have emphasized that as though here's a new transcendental property. There's being, unity, goodness, and so on. And also agency, whatever is active. I would regard that as a development of the concept of being.
I think despite maybe, if the caricature were true, despite the interest in, maybe the metaphysician's interest in holding fast to a non-changing ontology, I think kind of Dr. Murray is saying Heidegger's point is good luck. I mean, because this is just like science. Who's doing the science? Who's doing the metaphysics? We are. That we are doing the science and metaphysics doesn't change, because if we're not doing the science and metaphysics, then really nobody is. But we change. I mean, and who the ones that are doing the science and metaphysics does change. And I think that the attempt, if the caricature were true, I don't know if we ever saw that well, that in that way, even the attempt to split off the unchanging from the changing, in the way you described Dr. Schlimgen, I think is kind of maybe one of the things that Heidegger is trying to push back against.
Can I just add something? Maybe I'm a little unclear about the question, and maybe this will come back to your question too. I don't know. Maybe this wasn't. If we think of a concrete example, right? So just take the problem of universals, right? So we recognize similarities in things, right? He's wearing a red shirt. There are red apples someplace, red grapes, whatever. And so the question is how best to account for these similarities. And so you have these sort of perennial, I guess, disagreement among nominalists and metaphysical realists about this stuff. In addition to particular entities, right, particular objects, realists will posit universals, another category of entity. Nominalists want to just do with one category of entity, right? Individuals. So is this an issue about, unchanged? Isn't this a debate in metaphysics over the fundamental structure of the world in the most general aspect, right? Maybe something that science can't directly address. Cannot, right? We have to address it a priori in some way. So isn't that, either the world does contain universals, I take it, or the nominalist is correct. And this is, this has been a debate. It's been.
I guess
right? So the question is, when the nominalist says, "Hey, there are no universals," can they be justified in saying, "And I know it," right? Or is it just all a matter of opinion, man? So I don't know if that addresses the
Well, I
issue.
just think there's always debates, but the question is, are the categories, like is the category of the universal that the realist is talking about, does that have a history? Does the very content of the most fundamental statements of reality themselves develop, or are they just sort of like set in stone? I'm not, yes, there's debates. Lots of people disagree with everything about metaphysics, but within the very sort of take a view of metaphysics as sort of getting at it successfully.
But do you think that because let's say it does have a history, does that mean that this issue about thought about universals doesn't get at, can't get at, well, this is what the world is really like, or it isn't? In other words, either there are universals, or the nominalist is right? And if we agree to that, right, then there's a question about whether we're in a position to actually have metaphysical knowledge here about whether there are actually universals or not, given, lots of really, 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 really intelligent people have been on either side of that issue. And they, nominalists just aren't convinced by the realist argument, and the realists are just not convinced. And it's like, well, are we in a position, are we in a position to say, no, it's true, there are no universals. It's a fact.
Now, it might be pointed out that at least a few very, very, very intelligent people have thought there was a third possible answer.
That just makes the problem worse.
Unless this answer happens to be true.
Yeah. Well, no. If the disagreement, I take it this is what you were getting at, right? That there's this sort of perennial disagreement.
Well, because I'm wondering if, is metaphysics just something we keep asking, and we're trying to get at the marble that made David, or is it just like maybe the marble actually does change, and maybe we just look at it every 50 years and has a new pair of shoes, so we think it's an entirely different thing. So but really, it's still the same marble, just a different pair of shoes. If that makes sense. Can universals be time contingent or contingent on people thinking about them? And can they somewhat change, but not real? Maybe the question isn't.
Not as the not as a realist. we're talking about, right? They're just there.
Yeah.
We discovered it, and we talk about it all the time.
Could we try out this tertium quid, this third answer? Just to
Well, I'm
see?
trying to wonder, like, what is the third answer?
The third answer is that as universals, universals exist only in the mind, but there is a real foundation for universals, that is to say, the real similarities of things, and on the basis of the intellect's operation, we can form concepts that apply to all things of a certain type. Those concepts are universal, but their universality doesn't characterize them in their primary kind of reality, but only in their secondary kind of reality, that is, the reality in the mind. Some people have called that conceptualism or something like that, some middle ground between the very flat-footed realism that has been described up till now and the nominalism that seems to be the obvious counterpart.
So, can I ask if I'm interpreting this right? Is it that the universals we can't actually know, we can only just kind of see what they're showing us?
The universals are not themselves things, except insofar as they are modifications of the intellect, modifications of our mind. In that little tiny corner of existence, they exist, but that's the kind of reality they have. But their existence, or maybe better, their essence is to enable us to know something about the natures of things, and so to organize our experience and our knowledge of the world. Their nature is a purely presentative nature rather than a nature that has substantial existence. If our metaphysics doesn't allow for such things, then we ought to expand our metaphysics.
I'm curious, based on what you were just saying, could you name some philosophers that have this position that you were just describing, this middle ground position?
Many of the medievals, yeah, Aquinas certainly, and what I'm calling the perennial tradition, at least the version that I purvey, is one that precisely holds that view.
If I understand the view, I think it's contemporary thought is the trope theory, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if I understand that right.
It's closer to trope theory than other recent developments, but it maybe stresses the foundation in reality a little bit more than at least what I think of as trope theory when I do a little reading around.
I wonder what's the thinking about intellect and concepts there. Because it seemed, even the way, Jack, you were presenting it, almost like an in here, out there. So like intellect is this little part of reality. And I wonder
that was a metaphor, sorry.
Really?
Part, the word part was a metaphor.
As opposed to the whole, or what? I'm sure.
Well, parts and wholes literally apply only to physical beings. And I take it that concepts are not physical beings.
Well, I guess that's what I'm wondering about how to think about concepts, and whether or not concepts might be one of these examples of something where people's thinking about what a concept is may change and be very, very, very different. I mean, Donald Davidson likens concepts to sunburns, for example. Hegel makes a great point of saying concepts, to not think of concepts as if they were, mental, cut off from the world, which is more or less the same thing I think that Davidson's getting in.
I guess I would say they are mental, but don't think of them as cut off from the world.
But if they're not cut off from the world, then that may give you, then that
Their mind
may
is
change the
dependent.
pick, that may
Mind
change
dependent.
the emphases maybe in the way you presented that. In other words, that may allow for more realism, if you will, than,
Then you took me to be saying?
yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
I didn't intend it that way.
But as far as universals go,
That's
you
my-
intended universals to be taken less realistically read. You're taking a mind-dependent view on universals. So universals exist, but they depend on our minds, whereas someone else might say they exist, they don't depend on anything. Someone else might say they exist, but they depend on having instances. They
Right.
only exist when they have
Let's
actual
add one more
instances.
thing they depend
Yeah,
on.
right, and then
They
make another-
depend on the activity of mind. Because mind can
Of
have that
course.
sort of like still thing. That's thinking back in. Concepts depend upon a mind that's
Well, of
thinking
course,
about the world.
of course, the concepts don't just,
They're not plucked.
they don't worm their way in like a virus or something to the mind, no. They're the product of thought, as we've all been saying.
Any questions?
Yeah, I guess my question is kind of on posthumanism and like fundamentally changing the ontology of a being, say Dasein, who is no longer a being towards death, or you know, we're now bionic and we live forever. I mean, does this have any major implications on how we view ontology, metaphysics, especially natural science in relation to metaphysics? Seems like we're pushing towards that point, and we've been talking about in our biomedical ethics class, like the Nietzschean concept of being as becoming. Do you guys have any thoughts on posthumanism or its relation to ontology, natural science, metaphysics, and things like that? I'm just curious to plug your brains.
I don't know Heidegger as well as Heidegger. I remember being unconvinced when working through Being in Time that being towards death was a fundamental structure of Dasein. I remember being unconvinced about that. And I wonder too how the idea of fundamental structures of Dasein, especially if you're thinking about Heidegger, how that actually works out. Because it seems like one of the points that Heidegger has made is that things change, right? and that if it becomes the case that we are no longer beings that have to die, or that can die, maybe we can even go even more radically. Super posthumanism, we can't die. Wow, great. Don't have to worry about those trains anymore. But it seems like that. I mean, it seems like that's only a difference in degree as opposed to kind from the sorts of changes that happen all the time. Like I cut my finger today. How much does that matter? I mean, how much is it? I mean, it's my finger, and I'm not the one who's supposedly opposing metaphysical truth on the world, so it probably shouldn't matter that much. But I mean, I wonder if it's just a way of talking about things that seem very different to call them different in kind, such as the end of Dasein being towards death, as opposed to me cutting my finger. I think maybe that's why I think I also remember being unconvinced that posthumanism was dangerous towards the essence of human beings, probably for those same reasons. I think that get back to your question about posthumanism.
Yeah.
Why is being towards death a fundamental structure of Dasein? What is Heidegger's point on that?
I don't know quite what to say either. I mean, by that I mean, of course, part of it is, understanding is projective for Heidegger, and it doesn't take us too long to make the projection that we're gonna die, and then so I think he's trying to incorporate that into his account. What if we didn't die? What if our projective understanding wasn't projecting that in our future? You'd really have to you have to think long and hard about that. And probably not just think about it, but then this is also, I mean, like you, see, I mean, again, I think, and this is one of the things I'm trying to cite from Heidegger, that I think for him, you know, metaphysics is really about fundamental concepts. And so where, you know, that is a difficult area. I was thinking, like, it would be interesting, like a question, what is time? Okay? This guy who, one of the top science writers from Columbia, got a new book on the multiple worlds. Famous writer. I mean, you probably know him.
Gleek?
No, not him. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is, in the interview, on Terry Gross's show, at the end of the interview, she asked him, what's the question that you are most interested in? You can get the answer to one question. This guy's a physicist. So what is time? And then it occurred to me, I was like, is that a question that physicists are, I mean, is that a question that physicists are asking? What is time? Well, he's a physicist, he's asking it. Okay, that answers our question. In one sense. But in another sense, like if you go into your physics class and you say, what is time? It's like, Wittgenstein has a lot of examples like this, right? It's like, you probably say like, yeah, okay. Next question. Let's go on. I mean, we're, you know, so, but Heidegger, I think what he's saying is a lot of things, you know, things happen in the world. Science discovers new things, or new things happen, new developments. And it seems to me that the fundamental concepts, including fundamental concepts like what's essential to a human being, if you want to take Heidegger's analytic of Dasein basically as his answer to what's the human essence, which I think is roughly fair enough. Yeah, maybe either the essence would change, or some things might happen that would have us rethink the essence. I mean, what I was suggesting about historical materialism is that I think Marx offers us with the theory of historical materialism really like a further facet on Heidegger's fundamental analytic of Dasein. In other words, so Heidegger's got the idea that we're being with, he's got the idea even of a work world. In fact, in some ways, I wonder where he got it, partly from Capital, from Marx. But never mind. The point is, I don't think he really stresses the idea that in the work world, that the work world always has to be a specific social type. And that makes a huge difference. I don't think Heidegger has that. I think that's what Marx offers. And so to me, that's another kind of historical development in terms of, you know, really a fundamental elucidation of what it is to be a human being. So I think it shows how these basic things are kind of, you know, open to experience.
Sure they are. And Heidegger, I think, suffers now from this coming possibility of a singularity, as Time magazine called it, as some writers have called it, that the machine age and the human age will merge, and that should produce a change in our understanding of ourselves. I've always been skeptical about that part of Dasein myself. But there are still the questions of what does it mean, supposing that we can replace physically, part by part, a human person, and thus keep the human organism going for hundreds of years, rather than scores of years as now. Does that signify an essential change, or is that an accidental change? Those would be good philosophical questions. And so the facts of experience, as they change, will impact our philosophical questions. There's no doubt about it.
A few people have used this expression, essential change. What does that mean?
Well, going from being one kind of thing to another kind of thing, going from being being a human being to some other.
So really, there would just be a different species on the planet. The species humans would come out of existence, and a new species would come into existence.
Or the human species might continue to exist in its own reproductive way, but then there would be this other kind of being that has come along. And something like, I suppose, the way for a while Homo sapiens coexisted with predecessor species. Sure, but a substantial change, if there is substantial change, this is what it means, going from being one kind of thing to another kind of thing. If you don't think there can be that kind of change, or if everything is basically an aggregate of the most basic elements, and there aren't really fundamental types of being, then you're not going to even be able to, you're not going to have any motivation to speak about substantial change or any desire to investigate it. But if you think being a human person is different from being a bag of chemicals that is physically, whose physical makeup is identical with the person, as I do, then you're going to want to ask, well, why is the one an integrated substance and the other just a bag of chemicals? And that's where you get into substantial form.
Patrick, you were mentioning time, and guess what?
But this is no help to Heidegger.
No.
How do you know that unless you know what it is?
Well, yeah, I don't know if that's a metaphysical fact. I really don't know if there are any anymore. But I'd like to thank our panelists.